Up until now, so the day and a bit that we've done so far, we've really talked very little about sequestration. It's all been on the emission side. And as I said at the start, I reckon that's a strong focus on just understanding the emissions and the things you can do to potentially modify those emissions is a really good starting point, because we've got some tools there. Even though the calculators aren't ideal in the way they represent it, we certainly have some tools and some practices that we're familiar with that a farmer can apply, which isn't overly foreign to them. And so there may be some opportunities there, as well as opportunities to get the accounting, and the data collection side of it right. So there's actually a big piece of work in that before we even bother talking about sequestration or carbon projects, as most people sort of refer them to. I'm not going to spend very long on the tree side of it, because there isn't actually a lot to say around the tree side of it. But one of the opportunities is obviously in revegetation. It's one that I think will gain more support over time for a couple of reasons. One is that it's visual and you can actually see it. And so people are starting to favour it a bit more because it's a physical presence that you can actually see and measure if you want to, by direct measurement, as opposed to modelling and stuff. And so it's a little bit different from a soils point of view. So a few more are starting to move towards the tree side of it from that, I suppose, security point of view. To understand the potential credits that you may get from sequestration or the capturing of that carbon, in Australia, related to the ACCU program, is they use a computer program called Cam. Now, some people may have experience with Cam. There's actually 3 versions of Cam on the web. There's a version called the 2016 version where you could play around with all the numbers. The government realised that people were playing around with the numbers to get better values, so they brought out a 2020 version. That 2020 version had some embedded values for tree growth and things like that you couldn't change. So if you picked the ERF methods, the emission reduction fund methods, it locked in a whole lot of assumptions for the trees. And then if you ran that model, they knew that everybody was using the same base assumptions because you were having to use them simply by default. A bit earlier this year, there was a online version created called the 2024 model, or the beta version, the 2024 model. Up until 2 or 3 weeks ago, I've been using the 2020 version, and I could actually give you a template with it all set up and all recording and drawing the graphs. And all you had to do was change the latitude and the longitude and the selection of tree, and you could get a calculation of the model tree carbon accumulation for your location. Unfortunately, as of the 30th of September this year, that method that used that model was discontinued, and any new carbon projects going forward will be using this 2024 online version. The downside with that is I haven't learned yet how I can give you a template. So everybody basically has to create their own account online and then put the parameters in the first time to build a, if you like, a base template that then you can go in and start playing around with your latitude and longitude, so your location of the farm. I had a crack at writing some instructions on how to use the 2024 version of Cam. I was hoping to be able to give you, as I said, a template which would bring all that in, but I don't think I can at the moment, and I've sort of run out of time to work that out. But if you go to page 8 of the opportunities for sequestration Word document, it will have the instructions of how to build that. Okay, it's not overly intuitive, so if you get frustrated using it, I can fully understand that. It's the dog of a thing really to use. But what it does is it will give you a calculation at the end of the day and I can show you if people are really interested of how it all works in the output. But essentially, it gives you outputs for 2 lots of carbon that you can claim credit for. Carbon that is in the trees growing and carbon that is in the debris that is left behind as those trees grow. So you also get, over time, a credit for some of the debris that is left behind, that doesn't rot down in a short period of time. The models vary depending on species and locations and stuff like that. But rather than spend a lot of time showing you this as an example, if you did want to do something, I reckon it would be worthwhile if you're going out to clients and they've got questions on how much carbon will trees sequester, then I think having this set up so you can run it for their location would be valuable, because once you've got it set up once, all you need to do is to go into the program, change the latitude and longitude, press the button again, and it generates a graph, and you've got a table that you can export to Excel, and fiddle around and do other modification and manipulation of that as you see fit. Okay, but as I say, it's not overly intuitive, but worthwhile having a crack at that anyway. Couple of things I just want to highlight, which I think is probably the most important part of if we're talking about the tree side of it and where that's coming from. The first one is that if we're looking at environmental plantings, which is probably what most people would be considering on their farm as opposed to monoculture block plantings, there is one just called environmental plantings, and it makes an assumption of the types of trees and the density of trees that you're putting in there. One thing you do find when you run this over a long period of time is that the amount of carbon capture turned into CO2 equivalents per hectare varies depending on your location. Okay. This is generated out of the GAF tools. So I didn't show you it, but on the GAF tools, there is a tab there which is tree sequestration. You can actually go into that, and for your location, it will give you some generic values. So all I've done is pull some generic values out of the GAF tool. I haven't actually run the full CAM tool. I've just used the surrogate numbers that are in the GAF tool. But the messages are the same. Basically, where you're located makes a big difference to the amount of carbon capture or credits that you would potentially be given in those. And it's all based on climatic conditions, but particularly rainfall. So if you're in the Mallee after 50 years, you get about 14, 15 tonnes of CO2 equivalent credits per hectare. But if you're in the southwest, you'd be getting 35 to 40 over that same period. And it's simply a recognition of how well the plants grow. Higher rainfall, more carbon accumulation according to the models. So that's the first one. The second one is that there is a distinct difference, or in a sense, a penalty that you get if you tick environmental plantings to if you tick monoculture plantings. And this is one I've just pulled out for Tassie, but principle's exactly the same. That's what we get for the environmental plantings in the Midlands of Tasmania. But if we went to blue gums or we chose pines, we would get a different accumulation and, if you like, crediting of carbon over that time. And there's significant differences between those different selections. So 2 messages to take away: the higher the rainfall area you're in, the more likely you will get concentrated sequestration per hectare. In other words, more credits per hectare if you put it into trees. And secondly, the selection of species that you pick will make a difference as well. Okay, so 2 messages if you talk to your clients: location, super important, and type of species, super important. And it's why in the last few months we've had Gina Reinhardt in southwest Victoria buying up 1,000 mm rainfall country. I think it's highly unlikely she's going to be going dairy farming. She will be doing that to plant into trees, which are likely to be highest accumulation carbon trees. So it's likely to be something like pine trees that they will generate ACCU credits out of and use within their business as offsets, because her company is picked up in that safeguard mechanism and they need to reduce by 4.9% a year every year between now and 2030. So we're seeing, certainly in the high rainfall zones, increasing pressure of external parties, got nothing to do with agriculture, buying agricultural land because it's a way of being able to accumulate carbon quickly. A couple of other things I'll just mention very briefly. One is that if you look at the generic calculations that are in the GAF tools, they are based on the 2020 full CAM calculations. The 2024 full CAM calculations have changed the growth rate parameters. So all of those in the GAF tools as of the 30th of September this year are now redundant. They do not reflect what the 2024 full CAM model will give you. I've done just briefly in the last day a few comparisons between the 2020 and the 2024 model, and we're getting about a 20 to a 25% increase in credits using the 2024 model compared to the 2020 model for exactly the same location and the same parameters switched on. So there is a reasonable difference in the new model, giving you a greater degree of crediting, but it does mean all the old stuff that's been done is no longer, if you like, an accurate representation of what you would get if you ran the 2024 model. So hopefully that makes sense. This is just another example of this moving feast all the time where you think you've got it nailed and then things change. So there's a lot of work to update all of the tree stuff in the GAF tools to reflect that. It should be a bit of a nightmare for someone to do. But you do pick up those differences if you wanted to look at species differences just by using the examples that are in the GAF tool. But just recognise that they're not accurate now to what you would actually be credited with if you followed through with them. I think that's probably it. The only other comment that I'd make, and I'm going to come back to this diagram here, and you may recall when I put this up, we were talking about emissions reduction. There is a lot of discussion at the moment about biodiversity and biodiversity credits on farm as well. One of the reasons for developing the platform through AIA is that it is intended to be the platform where multiple of these recording functions can occur. So the idea is that for the biodiversity and the landscape sort of stuff that you may associate with tree planting and things like that, that would be able to be recorded and credited on the same platform as the emissions reduction stuff on the AIA tool. If we think we're a long way away from getting this right at the farm level for carbon, we're even further away with this as far as credits and all of that sort of stuff and mechanisms of how that might work. There are some things in the market at the moment, but we're still a fair way from like a broad scale on farm sort of stuff. Only other mention that I'll make, the final one, Emma, is that when we look at these calculations here, there's a bit of a concern people have that if they've already planted trees, that based on the ACCU scheme, you can't get credits for the trees that you've already planted, even though these graphs clearly show that if you planted trees 10 years ago here in the Mallee, you would still be accumulating carbon, and in fact only a third of the carbon's been accumulated so far in the first 10 years according to this modelling, and that there's still 2/3 of crediting to occur, but you couldn't generate these into carbon credits. The federal government at the moment is considering a scheme through Climate Active, and I'll talk a bit more about this again when we talk about ACCUs, where there is potential if you register projects to get credits for not what's happened in the past, but crediting for what's going to happen in the future as credits, still based on this full CAM type modelling. But the credits can only be generated and created and used on your farm against your products. Okay, so if people can understand that, you can't sell it to Qantas. They are not true ACCUs that can be traded anywhere. they can only be used against your own products. But for a lot of farmers, they're saying, I don't want to trade my accus and make money out of them, but I want to be able to use the carbon I'm accumulating on my farm against some of the products I've got. So if I need to lower an emissions number or an emissions intensity number for a certain product, I want to be able to use my on-farm credits. That is still not available yet. There are draft guidelines out, and I'll talk a bit more about that after lunch. But I just wanted to alert you to it now because the graphs are in front of us and I can just highlight that with you. The other thing with the biodiversity, yeah.
So we're talking about insetting there. Is that specific to that methodology?
Yes, yes, yes. So it's an insetting option. Okay, it doesn't allow you to offset or sell them to anybody else. I'll explain it more later on, Em, but I just wanted to raise it here because, as I said, I've got the graphs in front of me and I can sort of demonstrate it a bit better. The other thing is that there will be that tension between the biodiversity value that we may get and the carbon value we may get. And so while a number of farmers are saying, I planted these trees 20 years ago, it's not fair because I can't get credit for all the good stuff that it's done in the past, and I may be limited to what credit I can get going into the future. With biodiversity, it's probably going to be the opposite. The older the trees, the more established they are and the more time they've had to express themselves as a plantation, the higher the biodiversity values become. And so if we go back to this graph here, while we may lose out in the carbon bit of this overall sustainability framework, we may actually gain more value when it finally occurs in the landscape preservation and the biodiversity side of it. So I just say it's a potential positive for people that have planted stuff early and feel like they're being dudded from a carbon point of view. You may actually be further ahead in the game from a environmental point of view when this stuff kicks in. I don't know exactly when that'll be, probably before the end of the decade. There will be schemes operating in this front and you may get more credits because your trees are older.
I mean, it strikes me that a lot of that, we're talking about methodology for the market, which you're going to address later, Cam. And we kind of skirt around the idea of co-benefits and plantings on farm for shelter belts and other reasons as well. And I'm curious as to the conversations you might be having with clients. Do trees and vegetation ever come up, or is that something that they do as a kind of a decision that's non-related to your type of work? How many people would have a discussion around trees on farm?
I don't have.
Sorry, I'm just asking the room.
Oh, sorry.
I think about 50% of people, are having discussions about trees. Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, Cam, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say there are some that I've had discussions with around that, and it's mainly about the possible carbon crediting and this inset versus offset stuff, because most people are doing quantities that are relatively small, and to go through that whole process to create them as external accus to sell, the cost and the effort greatly exceeds the benefit that they're likely to get because they just don't have scale. So they're more interested in the insetting bit, which I said we'll talk about it in detail after lunch. But that idea of being able to create some credits that I can use against my own products is really what people are thinking about.
Hey Cam, just probably a question that comes up quite often is a number of people involved with vegetation plantings, like historically from like 90s to 2000s and all that. How will they fit in for being, especially if they might have been land care schemes previously, how will they fit in with future biodiversity markets? Yeah. Or are they eligible for any of that? Or
good question. Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't know the definitive answer on that. It depends a little bit under what scheme they were either supported under and who paid for them, as opposed to being implemented by yourself, as opposed to getting a grant for it, and then under what program that fell. So a lot of that still needs to be worked out to be able to, in a sense, double sort of claim benefits from it. So I really can't answer that, unfortunately. I thought the carbon game was hard enough, but when you get into this biodiversity stuff, it's getting even harder.